Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today, we are going to talk about political efficacy, critical components to the health and efficiency of the American political system is not just how the system is structured, but how well-informed voters are about the system and how much they can affect the system. And this is what we refer to as political efficacy. Studying it is not the most straightforward process in the world, as there are a whole bunch of other factors that can impact it, including educational level, emphasis on civics in schooling, personality, age, economic status, even political competitiveness, all sorts of things that can affect it. Nonetheless, however, there unfortunately seems to have been quite a dip in political efficacy in the American public in recent decades, though perhaps that's not a consensus opinion. Still, low rates of political efficacy pose problems for elections, including potential decreases in government responsiveness, electoral competitiveness, and healthy election and policy discourse. So today we're going to discuss political efficacy, how we define it, what threatens it, and some potential questions to ask about how we start to improve political efficacy in American politics. So let's get started. First of all, how do we exactly define political efficacy in general? Talked about it just a little bit in that intro, but at its most basic, there are two types of political efficacy. There's the internal, which refers to how much people know about politics. So do you know about current events going on? Who current elected officials are, like president or your congressperson, or appointed officials like the Supreme Court of the United States? Do you know basics of American civics and things like the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, which we just talked about in the last episode? How bills get passed, and so on. So internal is just about how much people know and understand about politics and how it's structured and what's exactly going on. And then you have the external, which measures how much people can affect politics. So whether people vote, that's the most obvious one, but also how often they vote, how much they participate in campaigns, whether they're advocates for certain bills or policies. Do they go and try to teach people about politics? Do they try to hold town halls about politics, and so on? So internal, because of how inside, how you understand politics, and then external, how you outside of you, how you actually impact politics. However, you can also break those two down arguably even further, because there can be a noticeable discrepancy in people's perception of their own efficacy and what their efficacy actually is. So with the internal, there can be a difference between how much people think they know about politics versus how much they actually know. And when it comes to the external, there could be a difference between how much people think they can affect politics versus how much they actually can affect politics, or how much they actually do affect politics. And one might argue certain things are a matter of both internal and external efficacy. For example, the many ways people can actually get involved in politics besides just voting. It's internal because, or it concerns internal efficacy because it concerns, do people know the ways that they can get involved in politics? And then external is, of course, the actual affecting of politics in those ways. Do you know that you can participate in campaigns by doing things such as phone banking or going door to door? And you don't necessarily need to be employed by the campaign. You can volunteer for it. And then different public opinion pollsters, political scientists, advocates, campaigners, and so on have different ways to measure efficacy. So there's no singular way to measure it. There's no clear-cut, okay, this is how we say what people's internal political efficacy is, how much, or what their external political efficacy is. There's no singular way to measure it, not necessarily quantitative or qualitative, could be both. It also depends on what your job is and what exactly you want to know. So if we take campaigners versus civics educators, for example, campaigners are, of course, trying to win elections. Civics educators are simply trying to teach people about politics. So if a campaigner is trying to figure out a voter's political efficacy, internal political efficacy, they want people to know what is on the ballot. They don't really necessarily care all that much whether people know about whether there's 3 branches of government or there's 2 chambers of Congress, unless it actually impacts the campaign. They mostly just want people to know who and what is on the ballot. Whereas a civics educator is just going to want people to know the basics of government and possibly who is running for office. So can be some overlap between the two groups, but overall, though, they're both trying to measure different things. So efficacy is just not a really necessarily straightforward thing to measure, but it is important to measure. Speaking of which, let's get a little bit more into the weeds of, well, first we'll do internal efficacy. So again, that is how much citizens know about politics. And there might be a difference between what they think they know about politics versus what they actually know about politics. So it's not necessarily a straightforward thing to measure and then compare those two things. And an internal efficacy measure could also vary for the same individual in different contexts. So they might know a lot about which candidates are running, but their understanding of the basics of government are kind of lacking. Or they may feel like they understand federal level politics, but not state level and local level. And that's the case for a lot of people because typically speaking, when you get further down the ballots, when you get more and more local, there's a lot less information that's available about those local level offices. And we'll get a little bit more into that shortly. But the Founding Fathers all believed in the importance of a well-informed electorate. They did not all agree, though, on how much of the electorate could be trusted to know about politics. And in the really early days of U.S. politics, after becoming an independent country, there was even being a white male wasn't necessarily enough to become a voter. Now, of course, back then is just prior to the 19th Amendment, so women were not able to vote, and then before the 15th Amendment, so black males could not vote, racial minorities could not vote. But even back then, it was only propertied white males. So if you're a white male, but you didn't have property, you initially couldn't vote in elections either. So there was some difference with the Founding Fathers as to how much of the electorate could be trusted to know about politics. But in any case, they all generally believed that a well-informed electorate was critical for the American experiment to succeed. Now, how do we study this internal efficacy further? You're not necessarily directly measuring how people feel about their ability to understand politics, but a couple of different ways that you can look at it is how well do people know their elected officials? Every so often, you'll see polls on whether people know who the president is, their congressperson, justices on the Supreme Court, governor, and these polls are not very encouraging in that regard. There are, I forget the exact numbers, but when it comes to the Supreme Court, very, very, very few people in those polls are able to name all 9 Supreme Court justices. And not only that, most of them can't even name one, or they can maybe name one, but not 2. And there's 9 of them to know. Campaigners also sometimes use what we call name ID or name identification when gauging support for a candidate, or whether it's their candidate that they're supporting, that the campaigner is supporting, or it's an opponent. They might say, "Who do you know who this person is, and what's your favorability on them?" And sometimes, if they have a low name identification, then they know, okay, we got to get our candidate's name out there. So that's another way that internal efficacy pops up. Another way you can do it is simply testing the electorate on the basics of government. What are the 3 branches of government? Executive, legislative, and judicial. how does a bill get passed? And, if you don't know, there's a fantastic Schoolhouse Rock episode about that. I'm just a bill. Do people know that basic pathway for bills? Not a lot of people do. What are the two chambers of Congress? There's a U.S. House and a U.S. Senate. And the vast majority of state legislatures work the same way too, except Nebraska, which only has a state Senate. So how much do people know those basics of government? Not just for the federal level. Do they know it for their state government? Do they know it for their local level? Another way to measure internal efficacy is whether states require civics education in schools, because civics education is critical for not only just the overall, for the overall health of the American political system, so that people know what is going on, but it's specifically is relevant for internal political efficacy, because if people don't get a well-rounded civics education, it's not necessarily that their internal efficacy will definitely go down, but it's a lot harder for that internal efficacy to be at a high level like it should be. But how civics education in schools looks can vary from state to state, because civics can encompass a wide range of relevant topics. So, for example, is there a standalone middle school civics course? Is there a standalone high school civics course? Is civics integrated into a normal social studies course? So it's not its own thing, but it's part of social studies. Is there a civics assessment? Is media literacy taught in grade school? And then you've also got to account for people who are out of school. So adults, continuing education. Are there civics programs for them? So all sorts of differences amongst the states in that regard. And there are unfortunately quite a few threats to internal political efficacy, and it poses some significant consequences for the American political system. So, for example, probably the biggest one is the ballot information problem. Basically refers to the fact that it's hard for people to find information about what's going on in politics. Yeah, for the highest level stuff there is, for president and Congress, you'll find a lot more information. But then when you get to the state level, there tends to be a lot less. When you get to the local level, there tends to be a lot less. People often don't know where to find information. And even when they do know where to find this information, it can be very time consuming. You have to actually take the time to go and research all this stuff. And for people who are working or have kids to take care of, it might be very hard for them to take the time to go figure out where this information is and then to actually go look up the information. The ballot information problem can even be an issue for those of us who work in politics for a living, especially when we want to look up local level politics. And if that's the case, if even those of us who are involved in politics for a living, if we're having trouble finding this information sometimes, how can we expect other people who are not so ingrained in politics to be able to find things? And it becomes a bigger issue the more obscure a candidate or a ballot measure is. So generally speaking, again, the more local something is, the harder it is to find information on them. For candidates, this is particularly the case for independents and write-ins. Sometimes write-ins are also independents, but you generally have a lot less information available for independents because they don't have the same channels that Republicans and Democrats do. Republicans and Democrats have their own local and state parties that can also help boost them. People already have a general idea of what that candidate stands for with that Republican or Democratic label. Obviously, there's variation in what Democrats believe amongst each other and what Republicans believe amongst each other, but there's a general idea that you have when you see that label next to somebody. When you have somebody who's an independent, you don't really get that same kind of thing. We call that a heuristic, basically a mental shortcut. And it's also the case, especially the case for write-ins as well, because you don't see their name on the ballot. You have to actually write their name in. ballot measures, especially when they're more local measures. They're like local bonds, for example, esoteric policy areas. So they're not the ones that necessarily get a whole bunch of fanfare. It can be very hard to research these things. And there's groups like Ballotpedia, who, full disclosure, is a former employer of mine, but Ballotpedia has made phenomenal strides in helping to close this ballot information gap, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. And Ballotpedia will, that's part of their whole mission is to close that ballot information gap. But there's still a lot of issues with that. Another issue for internal political efficacy is the decline of civics education, the arguable decline of civics education. Recent decades have seen less of an emphasis on civics education in schools, though the tide has somewhat been turning lately. But teaching civics is one thing. Having the programs there is one thing. What about its quality? And that can be a lot more subjective, but it's not just about having civics education. It's about having a quality civics education. And while civics education has made somewhat of a comeback at the state level, there's no robust continuing education curriculum for adults who are already done with school to learn about civics. So if they didn't have a robust civics program when they were in school, how do we provide it for them after they're done with schooling? Or they can actually just forget a lot of what they learned in school, because that happens to all of us. There's some things we learn in school that we forget as time goes on. So how do you remedy that? Whether they didn't get a robust civics education when they were in school, or if they did get one but they forgot a lot of what happened, how do we provide programs for those people? Because those are the ones who are actually, at least of the age to be able to register to vote. So how do we get them a proper civics education as well? You got to approach it a different way than implementing a civics curriculum in schools. Another problem for internal political efficacy is there's a lack of coverage from the media for certain government officials and electoral contests. There's many officials that a voter won't know about because the media doesn't cover them. And again, that's typically more local level people, like a city councilor or a mayor. And that's partly because there's generally not enough of a market to cover those people, especially in a much smaller population. When you got someplace like a New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, there's a lot of people in those cities that can vote on those local offices. So there will be more information available for them. But if you go to some random rural town, that's somebody might consider in the middle of nowhere, there's usually not going to be enough of a market to cover those people. So it'll be a lot, not that there won't be people to cover them, but the information will be a lot harder to come across and it won't be as readily available. So if there's not enough voters to care about that office, or it's too costly to cover that office, it'll be that much harder to find information on those people. So people won't know who those officials are. They won't know who's running for those offices or who's been appointed to those local offices or state level offices, and so internal efficacy decreases. And this also, again, contributes to the ballot information problem. Media is supposed to help bridge knowledge gaps on government officials for the general population. But if voters don't know enough about an elected official or a ballot measure, and they know they don't know about these things, they're usually going to decline to vote on it. Now, some people will think they know about these things and they don't, and they still vote on it anyways. But in any case, it still poses a big problem for internal political efficacy through this ballot information issue, this ballot information gap. And then again, with independents and write-ins, they tend to be disproportionately impacted by this because there's generally fewer avenues for them to reach people in the media. And then lastly, biased information, and this is not necessarily a comprehensive list of threats to internal political efficacy, but it's just some of the big ones. So you also have biased information. Obviously, bias is a problem, especially with how good AI is getting at faking and twisting things. And in addition to people willingly sucking up like-minded things because they agree with it, so it must be true, and staying in these information silos, internet and social media algorithms are also incentivizing media outlets and reporters to give people information that fits their worldview. So there's a lot of pandering, quite frankly, to people to tell them what they want to hear. And that's going to hinder internal political efficacy because they're not getting a well-rounded, unbiased view of what's really going on or who's running for office. And people just aren't, it's not just, and that's not to make it sound like, oh, it's only, media's fault or it's only the voters' fault. There's a lot of contributors to this. People also just aren't being taught well how to sift through this biased information. And again, you have groups like Ballotpedia who have done a tremendous job in cutting through all these issues, but it's still a very tough issue to deal with. And bias is not something you can just completely eradicate, and it's very insidious. And if we don't realize how our biases wreak havoc on our internal political efficacy, it's just going to keep on festering. It's just going to keep on being a problem. But that's enough on internal political efficacy. Now let's move to the external political efficacy. Again, what that means, it's how much citizens can affect politics. There can be a difference between how much people think they can and do affect politics versus how much they actually can and do affect politics. And like with internal efficacy, it can vary for the same individual in different contexts. So maybe that voter thinks they can impact local level politics much more than federal level politics by getting involved in campaigns and town halls and so on. Knowing politics is all well and good, but how do you impact it personally? And usually people just vote and then they call it a day. For other people, they get a lot more involved by participating in campaigns or organizing town halls. So some of the ways it is studied, and it's not necessarily directly measuring how people feel about their ability to affect politics, but one way to look at it is through voter turnout rates. That's probably the most obvious way to do it. And that can be measured in several ways, as I talked about in an early episode of the podcast. In short, it can be based on simply the number of registered voters. It can be the voting age population. So not everybody who's 18 years old is registered to vote. So you might base it on that because you're trying to get more people involved in politics, even by simply voting. So you might try to go get those people registered to vote. And then there's also voting eligible population. There are some people who, for one reason or another, typically it's if they are a convicted felon or if they're an ex-felon or they're in jail, depending on the state, their ability to vote is very much hindered. And each state has different stipulations for those people, whether they can vote or some of them, they can't vote until a certain amount of time. Some people, they immediately get the ability to vote back as soon as they get out of jail. Just several different, depending on the state, there's different stipulations. But voter turnout rates are the most obvious way to measure external political efficacy, because if you think you can affect politics, you're at least going to vote. Typically, if you don't think you can make any sort of impact whatsoever on politics, you're likely not going to vote. So it's not a foolproof measure by any means, but it is a pretty good indicator of, to some extent, of some people's external political efficacy. The There's also, of course, measurements of how much voters are involved in politics beyond voting. Talked about it a couple times already. Voting is the most obvious way to get involved, but you can also get involved by actually volunteering on campaigns, whether they are for federal, state, local levels. You can volunteer in elected and appointed officials' offices. Some of them have more public-facing roles that you can get involved in, where you hear constituents' concerns and complaints. You can organize discussions with people, just simply saying, hey, let's talk about what's going on in politics. Or you can have a more formal thing like going to a town hall. You can donate to campaigns and PACs. All sorts of different ways to get involved with the political process. Or you can advocate for and against certain bills that are being heard in Congress or at the state level or at your local level. All sorts of different ways to actually get involved beyond just voting. And then there's also perceptions of government responsiveness. How much citizens believe government can actually listen to their problems. That inevitably impacts whether people think their opinions and actions on politics actually matter. If you don't think the government responds to your concerns, your thoughts, your feelings, you probably have a low level of external political efficacy. And this can also partly be influenced by partisan affiliation. That's to say, if you as a voter, your party matches whether it's your congressperson or the president or governor or what have you, for a lot of people, their perception of government responsiveness and thus their level of external political efficacy depends in large part on the party of the person they're trying to reach. If you're a Republican voter and you're trying to get your Democratic congressperson to vote for or against a certain bill, a lot of times you'll probably think your external efficacy might go down because that congressperson has a different party than you. Same thing with a Democratic voter trying to reach out to a Republican congressperson. A lot of times, your partisan affiliation will have an impact on your external political efficacy. But then that could also translate to that same voter might have a different level of political efficacy when it comes to their congressperson versus their mayor or versus the governor or even the president. All sorts of different factors to consider. And then demographics such as age, income, and race can be factors too. When it comes to income, if you definitely have more capability of influencing the political process. Now, whether you think, whatever your opinions are about money in politics, put that to the side for a second. It's just a matter of fact that if you have more money, you have more avenues through which you can influence politics, namely the fact that you can donate to campaigns and PACs that support those campaigns. So that's how income can affect that. Age, typically, if you're an older voter, you'll probably think that your external political efficacy is higher than a younger person. Not necessarily the case, but for a lot of people, that is the case. And older people do vote at higher rates than younger people do. So in that sense, you could argue that the elderly's external political efficacy is generally higher than younger people. Again, not always the case, but for some it will be the case. And then when it comes to race, there is, for some voters, there's sometimes with voters of a racial minority, they might feel that they're not heard as much by their congressperson if their congressperson's a white congressperson. There are studies that have shown that black voters often perceive a higher government responsiveness from their congressperson if their congressperson's also black. There's a similar case for other racial minorities too. So race can also play a factor in external efficacy depending on which elected official or government official in general is in question. So all sorts of things there that affect your external political efficacy. Now, as for threats to that external political efficacy, one of the really big ones is public trust in institutions. If citizens don't trust political institutions, they'll think their opinions and actions don't matter, and many will stop or have already stopped participating in politics. They will stop volunteering for campaigns. They'll stop advocating for things. They might even just not vote at all. U.S. Supreme Court in particular has seen a noticeable drop in public confidence the last few years. Now, that's not saying whether the recent rulings that they've had, such as overturning Roe v. Wade, are good or bad. But if you look at public confidence polls, can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but if you look at public confidence polling for U.S. Supreme Court, it has gone down in recent years. So that poses a problem, not just, obviously for the overall health of the American political system of government, but also for the legitimacy of these institutions, because a lot of that legitimacy comes from the fact that people perceive these institutions to be legitimate. It's a similar thing with Congress. Everybody hates Congress. Everybody's hated Congress for a long time. Oftentimes, their approval rating is in the single digits, so you might have like 8 or 9% approval, and then over 90% of people disapprove of Congress as a whole, though they love their congressperson, generally speaking. So the fact that they see abysmally low approval can be seen as a form of lower external political efficacy. To use more specific, a specific study, Pew Research Center used a report from the National Elections Study regarding this question of the percent of people who say they trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time. And that has been at or below an all-time low, or it's been at the all-time low or around the all-time low for about a decade and a half now. So the trend has just been about the heights of people who trusted the government in this regard was during Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, and beginning of Lyndon B. Johnson's tenure as president. And you saw a sharp drop through the end of Lyndon Johnson's tenure as president through Nixon. Lyndon Johnson with issues such as the Vietnam War dragging on. With Richard Nixon, you saw it because of the Watergate scandal largely. There were a couple of points that it jumped back up over the ensuing decades. It jumped back, the percentage who trusted government to do what is right jumped up a bit during Reagan's tenure, and then during Clinton's tenure and the start of George W. Bush's tenure. But then it went back down again, and through Obama, Donald Trump's first term, and Biden's term in office, the percentage of people who say they trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time has not been above 26% in this past decade and a half. So that is also a huge concern. This general public trust in political institutions it poses a lot of issues for external political efficacy and for government responsiveness. There's also a lack of political competition in a lot of places. If it's a given who is going to win an election, whether it's for Congress or governor, the voters who are predisposed to vote differently are likely going to tune out. If a Democrat regularly wins like 80% of the vote, or a Republican generally wins with about like 80% of the vote, just as an example number, the other party is going to just be like, why am I even bothering? And then they won't show up. And then that can actually make elections even more lopsided. So if you feel like you can't change the outcome, it's a lot less likely that you're going to vote or participate in politics in other ways. So another way that your external political efficacy goes down. And unfortunately, there are many contests at the federal, state, and local levels that are just not going to be competitive. And that's why you see election forecasters, they rate a bunch of different races as safe or solid for one major party or the other. It might be safe Republican, safe Democrat, solid Republican, solid Democrat. Each forecaster has their own grading scale, but or not necessarily that, oh, it's a done deal that that party's going to win, but it's very, very likely they're going to win, and they're probably going to win by a lot. You're seeing a lot of elections that are like that. And less competition in elections has been shown by studies to have a negative impact on voter turnout, which, again, is a form of external political efficacy. So if we don't have competitive elections, I mean, not only do we, in general, feel like we have little impact on government, but government is going to have less incentive to respond to voices that are not the ones that they agree with. And then, just like with internal political efficacy, another problem for external political efficacy is the decline of civics education. As we said earlier, there's been a decline in recent decades in civics education quality and availability. Some states have taken steps to alleviate this, but even if civics education in schools is available, you still have to account for adults. You have to account for continuing education. So not only, teaching people government so that they understand what's going on, some people don't even know all the different ways that they can get involved in government. So it can be sort of both an internal and external issue. But so decline in civics education is another issue for external political efficacy. And then low internal political efficacy can also feed into this low external political efficacy. We touched on it a little bit already. If a voter does not understand politics, and they know they don't understand politics, they may be disinclined to try to learn more. In which case, then they're going to be much less likely to try to participate in elections. Trying to understand politics takes time and effort that many would-be voters are either unwilling or unable to put in. So, why is political efficacy so important beyond what we just talked about already? It might be obvious, but we really should talk about why this is such a problem. Because both internal and external efficacy are linked together. We would expect either both are high or both are low, but it's possible that's not the case. Some people may feel like they understand politics very well, but they don't feel like they can impact it. Or somebody may really want to impact politics a lot, and they feel like they can, but they don't necessarily feel like they understand it a lot. So it can be one way or the one way for internal political efficacy, and then another way for external political efficacy. But if they are both low, I mean, it's already a problem if one of them is low, but if they are both low, both in terms of citizens' self-assessment of their own efficacy and their true efficacy, that threatens the health of the American political way of life. Government becomes less responsive and accountable because citizens don't understand what's happening and they can't make an impact, or they feel like they don't understand or that they can't make an impact. Government will feel much less like they have to respond to large segments of the population, especially the people that very much oppose those office holders. Do you have a very strongly Republican office holder? They're probably not going to listen to those very strongly Democratic voters. If you have a very strongly Democratic office holder, they're probably not going to listen to those very strongly Republican voters. Or they might just not listen to the other party at all, even if that voter is not so strongly Democrat or not so strongly Republican. They might just not listen to them. That office holder might not listen to them anyways. But also, government just won't necessarily know what voters' demands are because these voters have just become too disenchanted to engage with the political system. They don't even bother saying what their issues are because they just think it doesn't matter anyways. So not just necessarily because the government official will be a jerk and doesn't want to hear differing opinions, but they may get a skewed vision of what their constituents think because they're just not hearing from all of them. And if people are just not participating in politics at all, especially through voting, that means elections are going to be decided by only a relative few voters who are the most ingrained in politics. And you see this a lot with local level offices. It's very common for races for mayor and city council to see turnout rates at like 10, 15, 20%, as opposed to the presidency, which might see something like, again, partially depends on how you're measuring voter turnout, but that might be more like a 60, 70%. And Congress might be like 40, 50%. Governor might be like 35, 40, 45, something around there. That just general idea of differences in turnout rates. Obviously, it depends on the states in question and what election we're talking about. But you still see this relative few voters deciding things at state and then especially at local level races. So we need a government that is actually representative of people as well. Issues with the lack of internal efficacy specifically, people then become even more susceptible to deliberately biased information, and they have less understanding of what is really going on in politics. Lack of external efficacy specifically, that means fewer people are involved in campaigns, which means fewer volunteers, which are a critical component to campaigns. A lot of people notice just the people who get paid to work on these campaigns, but especially for state and local campaigns, they rely heavily on volunteers. They can't pay everybody, so they need a lot of volunteers. And if they're getting fewer volunteers, then you're really just going to see the most moneyed candidates win because they rely less on these volunteers. So you're having just less participation overall, and not only with less participation by voters, you're having only the most powerful candidates being able to win these elections. And there's also a lack of pressure on government officials to try to act in service of all constituents, or at least most constituents. In short, if we want government to work properly and at the best it can work, we need to seriously address the issues facing political efficacy. Now, how do we exactly address political efficacy? How do we actually raise political efficacy, whether it's internal or external? Of course, you're not going to solve the issue right away, but we need to take small steps to start. So, important questions to ask first. How much of this issue is on citizens, and how much of it is that citizens are not being properly equipped to have a high efficacy? It's not meant to be a blame game on anybody. It's not, oh, citizens are at fault, government's at fault, educators are at fault, the culture at large is at fault. However, it is a good policy to think, how can we all contribute to a solution? How can we all do better in this regard? When you start just blaming people, they tend to tune out. It's much more about, how do we all contribute to a problem, and how can we all contribute to a solution? Focus more on contributing versus blaming. Knowing how each segment of the population can contribute to a solution will help us figure out the best methods for tackling and improving efficacy. We also need to think about what's the gap between citizens' self-assessment of their efficacy and what their actual efficacy is. We all at some point think we know more about things, not just political things, but things in general. We all think we know more than we actually do at some point. And we don't all fully understand how impactful we are or can be when it comes to politics, or we overestimate how impactful we are. So how do we measure this gap? The issue with this gap is, for example, with internal political efficacy, if somebody thinks they understand politics a lot more than they actually do, they're probably going to not be as amenable to information that they didn't already know previously. They are probably going to be a little bit more susceptible to biased information because, I've already got everything figured out. This thing that I agree with, I conveniently agree with, this must be correct. might not actually be the case. And knowing how wide this gap is between citizens' self-assessment of their efficacy and what their actual efficacy is also helps us in figuring out how to address citizens' self-perception and what they can actually do. Another question to consider: what are the most important things to measure to best tackle the problems facing political efficacy? So for internal political efficacy, what are the most important aspects of government for people to know? The branches of government, that there's 2 chambers of Congress, what each branch does, and so on and so forth. How do we teach these things to people? We talked about earlier how it's one thing to have civics education in schools and even quality civics education in schools, but how do you address adults who need this information? How do you address continuing education programs? How do we tailor that to different states and localities and just different geographical areas in general? Because you can't just have a one-size-fits-all in a lot of cases. There might be different needs for each state or locality, especially because they all, when it comes to their local government or their state government, it's going to function differently than a different state government or local government. So how do we teach those things? How do we teach adults that are already done with schooling? And then how do we incentivize people to learn more about politics? We're all human beings. We all need incentives or a lot of times we need incentives to go do something. So how do we incentivize people to learn more about politics? We talked about earlier how a lot of people, there's a lot of issues that face them in terms of, do they know where to find information? And even if they do know where to find information, do they have the time and energy to spend to find that information? So how do we incentivize those people if they don't have, or if they're much less able to go find that information? How do we address that issue? For external efficacy, what things should we measure there? How much do we pay attention to each non-voting method of getting involved in politics? Most citizens are not going to go beyond voting on an office, which isn't always a bad thing. For some people, not every single person needs to get involved in a campaign. But how many people should be involved in politics beyond just voting? How do we more effectively teach citizens the ways that they can get involved with politics, like with phone banking, going door to door, town halls, and so on and so forth? And once again, how do we incentivize people to get more involved with politics? What are the proper ways we should incentivize them? Because there can be, when you try to get people more involved with politics, there can be some very shady ways that campaigners and campaign professionals and candidates can try to get people involved, trying to entice them to get involved with campaigns. So are some of those necessarily a problem? And then, of course, what level of funding is needed for improving political efficacy? Everything costs money, especially when you get into politics. You need money for further academic studies of political efficacy, revamping civics programs in schools, implementing adult and continuing education programs. All these things need money, and money can come from various resources. Can be donors who really care about these things, government, whether it's federal, state, or local level, businesses, nonprofits, out of our own pockets, depending on what the initiative is for trying to improve political efficacy. That money needs to come from somewhere. So what level of funding is needed to improve political efficacy, and how far are you trying to improve political efficacy? Because that's also going to change how much money you would need to put into these programs. So all sorts of little nooks and crannies to really think about. But in any case, fixing issues with political efficacy is going to take a lot of effort from a lot of us, but we can do it, and we do need to do it. Regardless of how poor of a state we think internal and external political efficacy are, because it's not necessarily consensus that it's a serious problem. But I think there's quite a few indicators that we do have issues with internal and external political efficacy that we do need to address. And there's a lot of hard questions that we need to consider, but it is worth it to try to improve how much people understand politics and improve the ways that they can impact politics, because these are very critical things, critical issues for the overall health of the American system of government. So that's going to do it for today's podcast. And this is something that you can just keep going on and on about this. And maybe I'll do another episode about political efficacy at some point. But we're going to end it here because it's already another pretty long episode. But as always, thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, share this episode with your networks, your friends, your family, random people you know even, or that you just met. Even people you don't know, please share with them anyways. But obviously got the links in the show notes with my Facebook page, my LinkedIn profile, my book, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections, and how they could become more competitive, my free 5-day, technically 6-day educational email course about common mistakes made when trying to depolarize American politics and how we can take steps to mitigate those common mistakes and why we make those mistakes in the first place. And Matchmaker FM profile if you want to, and my email if you want to contact me about being a guest on this podcast, or if you want me to be a guest on your podcast. But that's going to do it for today's episode. So once again, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.